Hey guys, it's Mike from Fantasy Wargaming here. Today we are going to be doing our first episode of a little feature I like to call Campfire Chats. What is Campfire Chats? This is my opportunity to have sort of a chat with you about a unit or an aspect of the game or anything that may be overlooked that I find interesting, even if it might not necessarily be the most competitively viable. And the first episode is a doozy because I'm going to be covering the Darkoath Savagers, who are a unit that came out with one of the Warcry starter boxes. And it's an odd duck, but it has got some interesting potential. So, what are the Darkoath Savagers? Let's start off with a refresher, because I guarantee that for many people they won't have seen this wall scroll before. For 100 points, you get 10 of these dudes. They're 1 wound apiece, 5 up save, 6-inch move, 6 bravery, which is mediocre, basically. Their attack profile is also mediocre. 2 attacks each, 4s, there's no rend, and 1 damage. And then within that 10, 1 in 10 will get +1 attack, +1 damage. It is effectively like the leader of the unit, but you can have multiple leaders. It's a little bit odd. Warcry units are odd. 2 in 10 are proven and they get +1 damage. So they're 2 attacks, 4s, 2 damage. 1 in 10 is a God Speaker, which essentially lets you get a very slim chance for a free CP that's specifically for that unit and only until the end of the turn. It's very marginal. But what is interesting about this unit is its 2 special rules. It has Death Blow and Oath of Conquest. Death Blow is mortal wounds on 6s to hit. In addition, usually a lot of these mortal wound effects, they will cause the attack sequence to end. Here, you roll a 6 to hit and it will do the mortal wound, and then you'll keep rolling. So like the Proven or the Slaughterborn, for example, they can potentially do a mortal wound and their 2 damage from their attack. An Oath of Conquest, which is arguably even more interesting. Oath of Conquest lets the unit essentially unlock a 5-up ward for the entirety of the battle, provided they take an objective from their opponent. So they have to be contesting the objective, and you have to gain control at the end of the turn. But from that point on, they get the 5-up ward, they can move off the point. And that makes them an interesting unit, because suddenly you're paying 100 points for 10 wounds with a 5-up, 5-up that do mortal wounds. And that's obviously quite exciting. Let's talk about its potential. For 100 points, it's 10 bodies. So that's a very cheap screen that can also be relatively durable for its cost. It also is a sneaky good trading piece due to its mortal wound potential. That's not to say that this unit is going to be a exceptional damage dealer in your army, but it is a piece that your opponent has to at least respect. And in situations where you need to gang up on a unit, committing these guys, they can contribute damage no matter what you're fighting against. And third, and perhaps most interestingly, they are some sick models. Let's just take a moment to have a look at these models and get excited about the future of this Slaves to Darkness model range. Because for me, these look like the clear successors to the Chaos Marauders, as seen in the lower right, wishing that they could be as cool. What have we got here? We've got representation. We've got female Chaos Warriors who look badass. We have a nice blend of the old aesthetic and the new, because they've got these like sort of Conan the Barbarian vibes, while also really just blending in with everything else. You could put these guys next to Chaos Warriors, Chaos Knights, Vanguard, all of the newest stuff, and they would just look great. And there's a nice variety to the posing as well. So the God Speaker there in the top right has got a nice little detail where his or her, I think it's a woman, her eyes have been plucked out, and she is carrying like some large eyeball, which we assume she is using to see. And I believe the left leg is also ends in a hoof, like she's quite mutated. But yeah, just like a really, really interesting, intricate set of models. that are very dynamic, that have got a great variety to the weaponry, which means that they're not going to be an uninteresting silhouette on the table. So we talked about the damage potential. We've talked about they're how nice it is that they're a relatively cheap screen at 100 points. Obviously, they're more expensive than other cultist units. And when I say cultist units, I should say other cultist units. You'll see why in a second. But other Warcry warbands that got added to Slaves of Darkness, they are more expensive by about 20 points more, being at 100 points. But there's, a bigger high-speed problem approaching. I don't know how to put this, guys, but the Darkoath Savagers have been struck by that most heartbreaking of problems, which is that the Games Workshop designers didn't really pay that much attention when they wrote the War Scroll for them. And it leads us to the Darkoath Dilemma. So what is the Darkoath Dilemma? Put simply, we are looking at a unit that belongs to the Darkoath subfaction. And the Darkoath subfaction within the Slaves to Darkness book was always intended to be Chaos God agnostic. When the Slaves to Darkness Battle Tome came out in 2nd edition, there was a handful of Darkoath models. I believe it was the Chieftain and Queen, War Queen, I believe. And they were notable in that they were not allowed to take a mark of Chaos like other units could, unlike Marauders, which could. And this was a big point of contention because it meant that without a Chaos mark, they had really bad synergies within the book itself, because a lot of the things that make Slaves of Darkness work is its ability to stack buffs on top of one another. And suddenly you have this aspect of the book that didn't work well. And this was not just true for the Darkoath heroes, it was also true for the cultist units that came out in Warcry. And then between Broken Realms, Bellacore, I believe it was, as well as later updates in White Dwarf, they kind of GW backtracked and retroactively gave the Darkoath units and the cultists access to marks through various means, either through idolaters or I believe they can at this point they've just added a rule where if you add a unit to the army that's a cultist, you can just give them a mark. Same for the Darkoath. But they only specified specific Darkoath models. They didn't specify Darkoath keyword. And what this means is, because the Savagers came out afterwards, they missed the buff bus, to be blunt. So because they don't have the cultist keyword, they cannot be battle line, which means that they cannot be a Galician veteran, which you'll see why it's important in a second. Adding on to that, because they're neither a cultist nor they have a Chaos mark, they don't have that same access to buff synergies, and they don't work well in idolaters. You can't use the Chaos Chariot Lord to give them a prayer that way, to give them access to buffs. And we talked earlier about that fantastic kind of take and hold ability that gave them the war, the Oath of Conquest. Well, that battalion feels like it was made for Savagers, but they cannot go in Expert Conquerors because they are not a Galician veteran. So they can't count 3 as 1, 3 models for every 1 model on the point. So they're going to have a harder time actually taking a point to unlock that buff, which is a shame. Because imagine a world where they were cultist keywords, so we could just give them a buff no problem, or they were allowed to take a Chaos mark in other means, as is the case with the Chieftain and the War Queen. You could make them battle line, you could reinforce them twice, they could fight in 2 ranks because they'd be Galician veterans, you could stick them in Expert Conquerors, and all of a sudden you have this really interesting alternative to Marauders or cultist units that is a little bit, it's this like nice little sweet spot because they're not as mobile as Marauders. They're a hell of a lot more interesting than some of the cultist units that are cheaper than them. They would fit this nice little niche in the army that's currently not being fulfilled. And add on to the fact, it would mean that we'd have a really cool, neutral, aesthetic, not cultist unit, Darkoath model that can serve as battle line. But obviously, GW happened, so we don't have that at the moment. I expect that when it comes to the next battle tome, that will get tidied up, as they have done with the other Darkoath models. But until then, we have got to work with what we have. So we cannot put them in Expert Conquerors. They cannot be battle line. We cannot give them a Mark of Chaos. What buffs can we use? Well, the Chaos War Shrine, the Chaos Sorcerer Lord, and a third one which I've missed off here because of space constraints. The Ruinbringer Blade in Despoilers all give you full hit or wound rerolls. Favor of Chaos and Demonic Power is just a flat buff that they receive until the beginning of the next hero phase. Ruinbringer Blade is for the whole battle for all of your army against a specific hero or monster. So that can bring up their damage output because you can get those rerolls to hit to fish for the mortal wounds. If you wanted to not include a War Shrine, which is fair enough, it's expensive, and you wanted to use the demonic power from the Chaos Sorcerer Lord on a more valuable unit, if you were to put these guys in the Host of the Everchosen Legion, I forget the name of the special rule, but essentially at the beginning of each battle round, Archaon can point at a unit and basically give his entire army rerolls to hit and wound of 1 against that specific unit, which is not nothing. It does still buff up their damage potential a little bit. And finally, I've just rounded out with 8-fold Doom Sigil, which is the 50-point endless spell for Slaves of Darkness. You could include that if you manage to get that spell off successfully. You could give them +1 attacks, +1 attack each. But I mean, I don't think that's worth it because, as we've talked about in another video, with all the mega casters going around, I feel like trying to rely on an endless spell as Slaves of Darkness is a bit iffy. And you'd probably do better to just roll with Purple Sun if you wanted that kind of effect for 20 points more. Credit goes to AOS Stats Hammer. If you Google that or use the URL at the bottom there, it'll take you to the little utility I used to crunch some numbers. It's fantastic, and I'm planning on doing a video on how to use the utility in more detail because I think it's a great way to kind of assess units when making a list. But here you can see a comparison point between vanilla Savagers, Savagers with the Host of the Everchosen buff, or Savagers with one of the better buffs, that being the full hit wound rerolls, against what's their average damage for 10. So this is a 100-point investment against a 2-up, 3-up, 4-up, etc. save, with that dash at the end being what their damage would be against a unit with no save whatsoever. Now, what stands out here? Well, their baseline is reasonable. I mean, against a 5-up save unit, they'll do about 7 wounds to it, which that's provided they can all get in, which if you had a minimum size unit, you would have to, with 32mm bases, you can get all 10 models in. This unit has 7 of them on 28.5mm bases, which makes it a little bit easier. You have to be very precise, and it could mean that you lose out on 1 or 2 models damage. But the main guys, the leader unit and the 2 dudes that have +1 damage, they're obviously going to be in your front ranks. So you may shave off 0.5 of a wound on average from these stats, but I wasn't about to try and delve down that that whole conversation that you can have about how many models could you get in. That said, if you give them Favor of Chaos, Demonic Power, they could very reasonably kill Stormcast models. But the point here is that they can contribute, they can add on. I think they might succeed best without any buffs, or with the Host of the Everchosen buff, where they're ganging up with another unit just to contribute chip damage. Or you could reinforce them to 20, and then you would have 4 of the dudes with +1 damage, and 2 of the dudes with +1 damage and +1 attack. Now, at that point, you would accept that some of the guys in the back won't be able to fight. However, that's not the end of the world, because most of your damage is going to be from the front guys anyway. And if we accept that we're going to be running with the Darkoath Savagers in a list, we also have to accept that we're not really going to be trying to get the most raw efficiency competitive list imaginable. So, that being said, what might an example list look like for Darkoath Savagers? Now, because they're not battle line, I've decided not to build the whole list around them. What I want the Darkoath Savagers to be in an example list would be more of a sort of a sub-theme. It's an element of the list that we're including, but it does not comprise the core strategy. Now, there's a whole bunch of different legions within the Slaves of Darkness, and you might have thought that I would pick Host of the Everchosen. In fact, the first list I put together was Host of the Everchosen, but in the end I've settled on Despoilers. And I've settled on Despoilers for a few reasons. First of all, Despoilers is like a really interesting toolbox legion, which can provide line of sight blocking terrain. It can get a 5-up ward on a Demon Prince. In this case, in this list, I've got a Khorne Demon Prince for Blood Slits Ground. There's loads of little interesting things. So let's talk about it. My general has Paragon of Ruin, which lets D3 Despoilers units move 5 inches before the battle begins. So that can help the Darkoath Savagers get up the board, trying to take your opponent's territory quicker. We have 2 artifacts, so we've got a Command Entourage, Chaos Sorcerer Lord and a Chaos Lord. There are buff pieces. They could let one of these mortal units fight twice. Likely either the Chaos Knights or the Darkoath Savagers. It's also got Mask of Darkness for the teleport. Chaos Sorcerer Lord is likely just going to be casting Demonic Power. Probably on the Chaos Knights, but once they're gone, on the Darkoath Savagers. Be'lakor, because Be'lakor's great. He's a nice budget piece that also works really well here because he gets to heal every turn thanks to the Despoilers. And he also gets to trigger that line of sight blocking terrain. Call to Glory to give him full rerolls against a specific against heroes and monsters. And for those not in the know, Khorne Demon Prince has the command ability Blood Slits Ground. I mentioned that earlier. What that does is enemy charges and runs within, it's either 12 inches or 18. I think it's 12 are halved, which is absolutely brutal against melee armies, especially when paired up with redeploy, in order to basically make every inch that you move away effectively becomes 2 inches for the purposes of charges, because of the way that it kind of works alongside Blood Slits Ground. What can take a mark is taking the Mark of Chaos Khorne. Other than the Sorcerer Lord, who is forbidden, he has to take Tzeentch because Khorne doesn't like wizards. However, Khorne doesn't mind wizards who become wizards by holding a book. It's just a weird... It's the Arcane Tome being made after this book was released. It's a bit odd, but nevertheless. Our battle line are 2 units of minimum size Iron Golems for holding points, and 10 Chaos Knights with ensorcelled weapons, and then 2x20 Darkoath Savagers. And then rounding out the list, rather oddly, I have 3 Cockatrices. Why have I got 3 Cockatrices? Well, they're a Beast of Chaos unit that have a 10-inch range shooting attack that is just simply roll a dice on a 4-up, the target unit takes d6 mortal wounds. Cockatrices no longer give up bonus VP because the season has changed and they no longer do. We're now all about infantry. So they also contribute monstrous rampages. They move very quickly and they fly. So the idea here is they can gang up on units to try and wear them down for the Savages to take the point back off them. off your opponent, obviously, to get that ward. And they just give us a nice little bit of mobility, because between the Chaos Knights, the Cockatrices, we have like a nice roaming power pair that Be'lakor and the Demon Prince can kind of lurk behind, and the Savagers are coming up behind, as you can imagine, to kind of sweep things. It's a 7-drop list. We've got a Battle Regiment, a Command Entourage, and Bounty Hunters. So Bounty Hunters, I can put the Savagers in them, so I figured I might as well. They're rolling a lot of dice. It is a little bit of a damage improvement. And then the Chaos Knights work really well in Bounty Hunters, because they are, with all of the, without even casting a spell or giving out a prayer or anything like that, because they have the Mark of Khorne, if they're near the Demon Prince, they would be hitting on 3s, rerolling 1s, wounding on 2s, because they're +1 to wound from the general Khorne buff, and Ren 1, damage 2. And each one of them is throwing out 3 dice with that profile, and then 2 dice with horses, which is quite punchy. That'll be more than enough to kind of blow through things. I could see an argument to be running Lancers instead. To be honest with you, I wanted to throw this list together more to talk about the potential, what you could do with like the Savages sub-theme. I've not play tested this list, but I like it on paper. I think it could go 3-2. I don't think it would win a tournament, certainly, and it would struggle against overshooting armies, which, you know, Seraphon is a thing, so that's a problem. But it's 144 wounds worth of mean stuff, and I would be interested to see what would happen to Slaves of Darkness lists if they were to release a Battle Scroll update or an FAQ or a White Dwarf update, and they went, oh, you know what? We're sorry. I know that you wanted Darkoath to have the ability to take marks. We obviously gave it to the War Queen and the Chief. Here you go. You can make Savages battle line. You can give Savages a mark of chaos. Wouldn't that be so exciting for list building? Suddenly you could run 30 of them in Expert Conquerors for 300 points that would count as 90. They could get a 5 at ward. They could slap pretty hard, because they would then be fighting in 2 ranks. I love it. I'm planning on picking up a unit of 10 myself just to paint, because I love the models. But yeah, watch that space. This might be something that we have to keep an eye on for the next Battle Tome. In I believe it's winter, we're getting Slaves of Darkness. So that was our first chat. We've discussed Savages. I'd like to think that it was a fun little exercise. It's not something that anyone's really talking about. It's certainly, I wouldn't expect to be like a popular catalyst for discussion. But I wanted to do something a little bit different, because I wanted some of my analytical mind to kind of get applied to things that aren't just what is the current dominant meta threat. And there were so many little interesting units like that in Age of Sigmar that may be getting overlooked. If you've got an idea of one that you would like me to sort of talk about, kind of analyze and build around, let me know. I'm happy to take ideas. I'm happy to take suggestions. You can either comment on the video, or you can reach out to me on Twitter. If you did enjoy this, please consider following me on Twitter at LIUK or at FanWargaming. You could like this video, you could subscribe, you can check out my written content on Goonhammer. I do competitive innovations in the Mortal Realms every Wednesday, as well as review coverage for those guys. Goonhammer does fantastic work, not just for Age of Sigmar, but for 40k, for Kings of War, for Magic the Gathering. Pretty much anything you can think of in the nerd space, there's a very good chance that we provide coverage for it. And yeah, I will see you next time. Thank you very much for tuning in. Ciao.